Hello everyone, today we talk about the bête, the loup de Gévaudan, the Beast of the Gévaudan, a quite interesting topic between folklore, nature, partly even military, dating to the reign of Louis XV. This chapter of French history, as horrifying as it is, it's anecdotally enough interesting to appreciate sort of the times, the culture, the society of the era, and a bit also the natural world of pre-industrial Europe that we tend to forget a little bit, like how wild the European hinterland historically was, right? We don't have, of course, to go, but at some point we will make videos detailing things like, I don't know, the Uri, for example, that equals, as you know, in medieval iconography. Think about the founders of the Swiss Confederacy. The wild animals such as lions that, for example, in Southern Europe still existed in the countrysides of Southern Europe, and that represent, in fact, a great element, like in the life, in the folklore, and in the mindset of our ancestors that really could imagine the world of the time in ways that are very difficult for us to appreciate. And that's why the wolf of the Gévaudan, regardless of the debate that existed revolving the fact that it may have not been, but it was actually a wolf, and we will understand now how is bloody and picturesque enough for us to browse it in this sort of little compact video. And it's a very simple story, telling the truth, but just aside from the horrifying aspects of the same, it's quite fascinating because it actually is one of the greatest, say, episodes of man-eating incidents in Europe to be recorded, and one of the best documented to begin with. So, between the last days of June 1764 and the evening of June the 19th, 1767, the high windswept uplands of the old county of Gévaudan, the rugged country that today forms essentially most of the department of Lozère, right, together with the southern fringe of the Haute-Loire, to the northernmost tip of the Ardèche, silvers of Cantal and Aveyron, a territory of approximately 4,200 square kilometers, with an average elevation almost everywhere above 1,000 meters, making it, as a consequence, also one of the highest and coldest permanently settled regions of France, outside the Alps and Pyrenees. We're in the south, but it's essentially part of the broader Massif Central orographic conglomeration that makes, in fact, this lands one of the most sort of fairy tale settings for this kind of horror story, right? If you think about Beauty and the Beast, there is definitely something to it in it, and it's very archetypally interesting as a whole. And this world lived one of the longest and most terrifying sequences, in fact, of lethal animal attacks ever recorded in Europe. Parish registers, surgeons' reports, notarial, so-called procès-verbaux, that is to say, verbal processes, so proper witnesses, right? Letters from bishops, intendants, and military commanders, and the meticulous correspondence of the syndic, Etienne Lafont, established beyond reasonable dispute 99 unquestioned, that is confirmed, human deaths and roughly 30 further persons gravely wounded, yet surviving these attacks. Recent exhaustive cross-checking of all surviving parish registers and hospitals recorded by Jean-Marc Morisseau, this is a research carried out in the 10th of the 21st century, raises the certain death to at least 101, with 113 highly probable when including contemporary medical certificates. Modern studies that include doubtful or merely rumored cases raise the probable total to between 88 and 124 dead. dead alone. Almost without exception, the victims were women and children, as we will see, not just because they were the weaker element of society. These were solitary shepherds or shepherdesses on high summer pastures at the edge of dense forests or on lonely paths, because in this pastoral society, boys and girls from the age of 7 or 8 were routinely sent alone or in pairs, a bit like Hansel and Gretel, to guard cattle and sheep several kilometers from the nearest village, while adult men remained closer to home for plowing and heavier work. The pattern this youth was attacked is incredible. Struck in broad daylight, almost always at the throat or the face, scalped, facially mutilated, partially devoured, or simply left dead where they fell on highland. I almost got myself killed when I was a kid up in the mountains. In any case, this attack pattern, sudden rush from cover, crushing bite to the throat or head, dragging the body a few dozen meters, is identical to documented man-eating wolf behavior pretty much everywhere, also the time in Scandinavia, Italy, and India. The terror of these attacks spread far beyond the immediate killing grounds, carried first by the Courrier d'Avignon and the Gazette de France, then reprinted in London, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, and beyond. At the time, with at least 42 separate pamphlets and broadsheets published in 1765 alone, the affair of the Beast of Gévaudan became the longest-running serial horror story of 18th century Europe. Right? This is also documentarily, methodologically speaking. Think about that. Think about how many attacks had historically existed, but how just because of the lack of the press, of sort of better communications, also the general echo of an emerging public opinion, were not recorded. We don't have trace of that, but normally belong to European and non-folklore. The first victim formally recognized in the Gévaudan affair as having fallen to what would soon be called, in fact, la bête, so the Beast of Gévaudan, was Jean Boulet, 14 years old, the first of this unfortunate company, killed on June the 30th, 1764, at the hamlet of Les Ubacs in the parish of Saint-Etienne-de-Lugdares on the Vivarais bank of the Upper Allier. The parish then contained only 278 inhabitants. Think what it meant to live in such communities. By the way, 278 inhabitants scattered across 27 isolated hamlets, and therefore easy prey for concentrated attack. The entire diocese of Mende had barely 80,000 souls in 1760. The girl was buried the following day, quote, sans sacrement, ayant été tuée par la bête féroce. The entry, squeezed in later between two others and initially omitted, already betrayed the administrative disorder that would characterize the whole episode, right? She had been buried without sacraments since she had been killed by this ferocious beast. And this, imagine how traditionally irrelevant and shocking this thing is, right, for the minds of the time, right? This was the case because the person had died suddenly, violently or unexpectedly, with no time for a priest to be called. Jean Boulet was attacked while tending cows in a remote pasture. Her throat was torn out. She died almost instantly or within minutes. There was simply no possibility of fetching priest in time. So this is basically, she died so fast that we couldn't give her the last rites, right? This, because again, it's not like a deprivation. Like, you can't administrate the last rites to a dead person. That was not a punishment because it's being devoured by the monster, but it was this overall tragedy. It already shocked as a single episode and prefigured what would occur. Marginal additions, by the way, and corrections of this kind were common, especially in mountainous parishes where the curé could be absent for weeks, and so they had to get there before realizing what had happened. So that's how far from civilization these people are. And this is incredibly interesting because even though we are in the 18th century, there are places in Europe, and even in France, where there are, again, communities living just out there, and they're practically not connected with some sort of broader concentration. Earlier the same month, a young cowherd near Langogne had fled with torn clothing after her cattle formed a protective ring and charged the attacker. Cattle forming a defensive circle around children is a behavior repeatedly attested in French, German, and Italian wolf attack reports from the 16th to the 19th century. If you think about it, it's really beautiful and shows how intelligent nature is and how also sort of union makes strength against predators. Through July and August, further deaths occurred along the Upper Allier and in the forest of Mercoire. By late August, the diocesan syndic at Mount, Etienne Lafont, a lawyer born in Marvejols in 1719 and subdelegé of the intendant of Languedoc, whose personal archive of 612 letters and reports on the affair is preserved at the departmental archives of the Lozère, was coordinating local hunts and writing urgently to both the Intendant Saint-Prix in Montpellier and the provincial military commander, the Comte de Montcalm. Throughout September and October, the predator, or predators, by the way, moved steadily northwestward. On October the 7th, a girl was killed at Apcher in the parish of Prunières. Her severed head was recovered only 8 days later. Complete or near complete decapitation, by the way, occurred in 38% of autopsied cases, which means that the proportion was far higher, not just of the 38%, but obviously and especially than in Norman wolf attacks. We'll explain this behavior because, again, this was likely just sort of a pretty big bad wolf, so to say. But there was something nervous about this, something psychological, that this animal or animals, that because the thing may have spread by mutation by the wolf pack leader that had probably a vicious targeting of its victims. And by the way, it was indicative of exceptionally powerful individuals. Right, cutting somebody's head is fairly easy if you manage to pass with a blade through the vertebrae, but freaking devouring, like properly disarticulating somebody's head, like with a wolf snares, it's something incredibly difficult. At least you need a lot of power to do that, and this animals definitely had it. And we'll see how, in fact, the thing turned out to be. The next day, to the last incident, so we're in the autumn of 64, this boy narrowly escaped near Lafarge Montivernoux when his cattle intervened once again. Shortly afterwards, 2 hunters near Prince-Vesoul fired at the creature at point-blank range, saw it fall twice, then watched it limp away, the first documented wounding of the bat. In the same month, the beast reached its southernmost recorded point with the death of Marie Solinac at Les Bruyers, in the parish of Les Ormeaux. By November, the predator was ranging across the high plateau of These basalt plateaux, deeply dissected by ravine and covered with soil too poor and acidic for cereal cultivation, supported only extensive transhumant grazing of cattle and sheep. On October the 14th, 1764, the Comte de Montcalm issued orders authorizing Captain Jean-Baptiste Duhamel of the Légion de Clermont-Prince to requisition men and resources throughout Gévaudan, Vivarais, Velay, and the Cévennes to destroy, quote, le montre ou léopard. Interestingly enough, because they thought it could be another kind of animal, right? Wolves, this is notorious, like bears, normally they do not really attack men, right? They do not have that instinct. Even when they're desperate or hungry, they have normally a different behavior. So even at this point, imagine the voices, not just among the people, etc., but also among these informed noble men who had sort of toured the world and already, like at least from the naturalistic knowledge of the era, they knew that the wounds reported from the autopsies were abnormal for a wolf. They started thinking this is another animal. This is like a big feline or something, because it's not really possible, right? Duhamel, and by the way, because wolf attacks were also kind of normal. There is still today in Gévaudan a park for the wolves, and at the time, again, it was just part of there are lots of the paintings I used, many are properly documenting the Beast of Gévaudan, but in general there are lots of wolf hunts and general attacks on cattle and people at the same time. So it happened every once in a while, but this one was really abnormal and serial in particular, in a shocking fashion, given the way that the victims were found. Duhamel, born in Amiens, so he was a Picard, in class of 1732, was a minor nobleman who had risen to captain, as we've seen, in the light troops raised by the Prince de Condé during the 7 Years' War. I recently made also multiple videos about this. So you have here like a militarily experienced, in fact, aristocrat, as it was normally the case. Also made a video about 18th century French small aristocracy in military career. They were the backbone of the great French royal army, a sort of tendentially hegemonic power in Europe. And this man arrived with 56 picked men, right? 39 foot, 17 mounted, armed with sabers and rifled carbines, which interestingly connects with the video that we made about the Pennsylvania/Kentucky rifle of the American War of Independence that was just a decade away from this, and that were particular types of weapons already sort of more dedicated to precision. All right. And as you can see also in the images that I inserted since the beginning, these men were also uniformed, wearing the distinctive ventre biche coats of the Condé livery over red waistcoats. All right, maybe not the best to mimetize and catch the animal by surprise, but still the military showing up and giving, in this sense, some moral, political sort of reassurance to the local inhabitants that the government was doing something about this massacre. The Légion de Clermont-Prince was a volunteer light infantry corps created in 1760. Its soldiers earned 9 sols per day plus bread and meat rations, almost double the pay of ordinary line troops, so they were somehow picked. Heavy snow delayed, however, systematic operations until mid-November, because already at that point it was full of snow in these highlands. So these troops quartered at Saint-Etienne-de-Lugdares, bivouacked in farm courtyards. Of course, the local peasants were glad to have these guards with them, at least to an extent. The troops also set disguised sentries. For example, literally soldiers dressed as peasant women, accompanied by mastiffs, and conducted endless battues. Why that? Because they also believed that this was actually some kind of serial murder, right? That the animal may belong to someone, there was a maniac around, and you can imagine, again, in the very unsecular, very unmodern 18th century mentality, how this had to appear like a divine punishment for the sins of the locals, a devilish presence, something horrifying in spiritual terms, other than just the results of this all. Some of Duhamel's battues mobilized up to 20,000 local peasants, forming human chains several kilometers long across the plateau, because they wanted to box the animal. 5 more victims, however, fell in December alone. I would like to stress how abnormal it is for any wolf attack to be serial, to kill all these people and with this ferocity. It's really not normal. And this is why this also became so famous. It's not just much the amount of people killed, but the fact that apparently this was caused just by one or just a few beasts. The État de Languedoc voted a bounty of 2,000 livres, these pounds, soon raised by the king, Louis XV, to 6,000. Imagine even at Versailles how the story was sort of attracting everybody's attention. 6,000 livres represented roughly 20 years' wages for a Gévaudan day labor, just to get a bit like the proportion, the investment for putting an end to this monstrosity in the far Occitanie. On December the 31st, 1764, the Bishop Count of Gévaudan, Gabriel Florent de Choiseul-Beaupré, cousin of the reigning ministers, published from every pulpit his celebrated mandement declaring the beast a divine chastisement for the sins of the province and ordering 3 successive Sundays of 40-hour devotions. If you're interested in French spirituality, I made a video about at least medieval times, the liturgy, relics, geography, martyrology, and so on. Analogous episcopal declarations of wolves as divine scourges had been issued in France, by the way, in 1632, 1691, 1713, and 1746. This thing had happened, right? But never at this scale recorded, at least. And it shows like how seriously these matters were taken, probably also in a sociological and religious sense. In all this, horrifyingly enough, the killings continued unabated. On January the 12th, 1765, 7 children aged 8 to 12 grouped together for safety at Le Villaret in the parish of Chaneleye beat off the animal with pointed sticks after it had torn the cheek from the youngest. The eldest, Jacques-André Portefeuille, born on November the 8th, 1752, was subsequently educated at royal expense because of this, so rewarded for having essentially fenced off the beast's attack, admitted to the Frères de la Doctrine Chrétienne in Montpellier, and later became an artillery officer under the name Jacques Villaret, dying at Franconville around August 14, 1785. Portefeuille received an annual royal pension of 312 livres for life, approved personally by Louis XV, who was really struck by this. But by the way, imagine, aside from the kid, but those who had really seen the beast, like, what does it look like, right? There are no photos around. You can imagine, as we'll discover now, what also impression this animal would have made, given the character of the physique of the same. In February 1765, Louis XV dispatched the realm's most famous louvetier, Jean-Charles Marc-Antoine Vaumel de Neval, and his son Jean-François, credited with more than 3,000 wolves destroyed in Normandy. The louvetiers were probably the wolf hunters. These were really professionals in their field, so they were the best men, distinguished themselves in the northern province. sent to the south to help their compatriots. Their official total of 3174 wolves killed between 1739 and 1764 is, by the way, recorded in the archives of the Gant Louveterie Royale, because at the time there was the chasse, was the battue, was something big, right? We are in the Ancien Regime, and even war is understood as some sort of aristocratic sport, right? Hunting is the nobiliar pastime par excellence, a training for war. So it was seen as a very important activity. And in the vast France, the beautiful landscape, still many forested areas, and so you could find these very peculiar types that specialize in this massive head count. Now, this family, by the way, the Neval, insisted on exclusive direction. By the way, they wanted to control the entire hunt. And they obtained Duhamel's recall in April, conducting vast drives that repeatedly failed. However, the beast was smart. That's what it means. And we know because, meanwhile, individual acts of resistance not just increased but multiplied. Right? On March the 14th, 1765, Jean Jouve, wife of Pierre Marlet at the Mas de la Bessière in the parish of Saint-Alban, fought hand to hand to save her children, grappling with the beast until her elder sons drove it off. Her 6-year-old Jean-Pierre died 5 days later from the wounds received, but she obtained 300 pounds from the king as a sort of not just so miserable consolation. The payment came directly from the king's private purse, the cassette royale. It was an exceptional honor to help this broken, traumatized woman. On May the 1st, near Les Malzieux, the brothers Marlet fired twice into the creature at 200 meters, wounding it visibly in the neck. They understood they had shot it in the neck, and yet, right, the animal escaped despite pursuit by the de Neval's hounds that had been unleashed. By spring 1765, the affair had become a veritably European scandal. On June the 8th, Louis XV sent his own porte-arquebuse, so arquebuse bearer, François Antoine, that is a bit the sort of the most famous figure in the history of the Beast of Gévaudan. Antoine at the time was age 70, which was already a feat for the era. He was, however, like a distinguished figure, lieutenant of the captaincy of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, with 8 royal guards, further guards from the princes of Orléans and Condé that had taken a heart to this matter, and a pack of limiers. Antoine's annual salary as premier lieutenant de chasse, say, was 6,000 livres, one of the highest hunting salaries in the kingdom. He was the actual man to solve this matter. We would like to stress this man had military experience, right? So they were called on purpose to cope with an extraordinary threat, emergency, and danger. Antoine arrived convinced he faced nothing more exotic than a very large wolf, as a matter of fact. On August the 16th, 1765, during a great hunt near Montchavet, Antoine's guards, Pélissier and Lachenet, were deliberately misled into a bog by 3 local men identified in the official report only as, quote, Châtel-le-Père et deux filles. So essentially, just, again, this guy with his sons. When Pélissier seized the youngest, the father and the other son leveled their guns. Antoine had 3 incarcerated at Zog, with instructions that they remain in prison 4 days after his own departure from the province. And why do we talk about them? Because remarkably, and this was the human track of the investigation, no further fatal attacks occurred during the weeks these men were detained. Whoever the prisoners actually were, by the way, because again, we have just the names of these three, but we don't know what kind of role they had, but probably some peasant. Now, the Zog prison register for August to September 1765 survives and explicitly names the three men nommés Châtel, held for, quote, insulte grave à l'autorité royale. On September the 21st, 1765, after surrounding the Bois de Pommier near the royal abbey of Les Chazes, Antoine and his guards shot a huge male wolf of approximately 130 pounds, something like 58 kilos. This weight places the animal in the top percentile of all measured 18th century French wolves. The heaviest authenticated French wolf before 1900 weighed 62 kilos. By the way, as late as that. Survivors, including Marie-Jeanne Vaillet, who on August the 11th had thrust a bayonet-tipped pike into the animal's chest near Pauillac, and been dubbed as a consequence La Pucelle de Gévaudan, a bit like a novel Jeanne d'Arc, positively identified the carcass. This was at least apparently the Beast of Gévaudan, that notoriously was stuffed, carried to Versailles by Antoine's son Robert François Marc, and exhibited before the court. We have depictions of this in sort of also some weird fashion, literally with the king next to the stuffed wolf, etc. As a consequence, the affair was declared closed. Antoine received the right to add the dying wolf to his coat of arms, by the way. Yet, from November 1765, isolated attacks resumed, becoming frequent again in 1766. Now, the animal now operated almost exclusively in the northern triangle formed by Montmouchet, Montgrand, and Montchauvet, an area of scarcely 300 square kilometers of extremely broken, forested, and boggy terrain that, however, you can't basically cover in a day, at least in depth, behaving at this point with greater caution, apparently, if we're talking of the same animal, because as we'll see now, likely this was an actual pack, like the wolf was positively identified by those that he had attacked, but he likely wasn't alone, and we think that he had sort of radicalized, enraged other wolves that had started imitating. And this behavior, we'll explain it partly later, but it sort of, it does happen, right? But it's interesting because it is psychological at the end of the day. At this point, by the way, this other wolf avoided large organized hunts, and the killing was concentrated primarily in the cantons of Zog, Pinol, and Le Malzieu. The man who would finally kill this beast was Jean Chastel, baptized on March the 31st, 1702 at the hamlet of Darnes, in the parish of La Bessère Sainte-Marie, son of Claude Chastel and Jeanne Vergogneau, or Bergonon, by the way, major just at the time how names could be sort of modified. Chastel, which is actually also the more, at least folklore figure tied to locally, is the godson of his uncle Jean Chastel and his owned by Mère Chalet of Pauillac and Marguerite. So we can trace his full family history. And on February 22nd, 1735, he had married his native parish Anne Charbonnier, daughter of a stableman. It's sort of typical background. 9 children were born to them: Jean, Agnès, Pierre, a second Agnès, Claude, Jean-Marie, Jean-Antoine, Catherine, and Jean-François. Several infant deaths went unrecorded because the Curé of La Bessère-Saint-Marie at that period did not register the burial of very young children. By the way, imagine again the times. This is incredibly fascinating. Jean Chastel was literate, rare among local peasants, regularly signed parish registers, was known as a skilled hunter and an occasional poacher, worked as day laborer and innkeeper, and bore the Occitan nickname de la Masca, son of the witch, right? Which is sort of disturbing in a way, but still. His brother Jean-Pierre, 1714-1779, lived as a fugitive after being condemned to death for murdering their nephew Joseph Pascal, which is, again, part of the local folklore. You can imagine, we know, by the way, through social anthropological studies, what their broader peasant lifestyle really was. It's something devastating. Also, we know of the sister Jeanne, 1717 to 1736, so she died young. So, why is Jean Chastel important? Well, he first appears in the Beast affair on February the 13th, 1765, when, hunting with his sons, he remarked that the animal was limping on 3 legs. An observation he later denied, by the way. On August 1765, the incident with Antoine's guards took place, whether the 3 imprisoned Châtel were Jean and 2 of his sons or homonyms from the same extended clan remains uncertain. But the complete cessation of deadly attacks, as we've seen during their detention, is documented. So you understand the kind of tonic and sort of cursed background of these individuals. After the Wolf of Le Chasse was proclaimed the beast and exhibited at Versailles, attacks resumed, as we've seen, and they raged for late 1765-1766. On May 16, 1767, Marie-Jeanne, about 12 years old, from the hamlet of Sepsol, 2 kilometers south of La Bessère-Saint-Marie, was divorced. Jean Chastel countersigned her burial entry the next day. On June 17, 1767, the beast killed 19-year-old Jean-Baptiste at Les Binières in the parish of Desges. The 19-year-old Marquis Jean-Joseph d'Apcher, Lord of Besque, immediately organized a hunt for the following day in the Bois de la Thénazère on Montmouchet. Just imagine the darkness of this, this young girl dead, and they had to immediately organize. Also, logistically, was not, I feel like hunts were quite of an expense. Now, among the dozen armed beaters was Jean Chastel as well. At the place called La Sainte-Deuvert, the animal crossed directly in front of him. Chastel fired once, striking it in the shoulder with a load of 5 large shot. It fell. It was overwhelmed by the D'Apcher's hounds and was carried dead to the Château de Besque. The next day, June 1767, the notary Roche-Étienne Marin and the surgeon Boulanger measured and described the animal in detail. Length from snout to tail, root 3 feet, 900 centimeters, extraordinarily broad chest, 11 pouces, 29.7 centimeters, black eel stripe along the spine, white heart-shaped mark on the breast, dental formula of a canid, 20 teeth upper jaw, 22 lower, but proportions and coloration judged highly unusual for local wolves. So in other words, even though the first animal had been recognized, this was the freaking beast, right, in all terms. And this is the animal that created a bit all the broader mystery around the event. It made also of Chastel the most important figure, at least in the story overall. Now, consider this. The chest width of this animal was 29.7 centimeters, which is really exceptional for a wolf. Modern Eurasian gray wolves rarely exceed 25 at the same age, right? And numerous survivors who viewed the body declared it the creature that had attacked them at the same time. So it is possible that this was actually the real animal, and that the conflicting reports do not account for the first recognition. In fact, what also makes you think, like, if the greatest attacks had happened during the first wave, and after this animal sort of was, as we've seen, more timid, as a matter of fact, why was it the case? Did he actually understand that his friend had been massacred? And that, because, as you've seen, that wolf had a wound, a scar, and the same woman who inflicted it upon him recognized it. So this other animal must have been part of the whole picture, because, as we've seen, the exceeding deaths, albeit at a lower rate, are still indicative of this wave. And so, speaking of an actual wolf community here, the most striking thing is also that from that day, no further fatal attacks were recorded anywhere in the region. Fatal, at least. 6 days later, on June the 25th, another hunt in the same area killed a large she-wolf whose trail had been followed from the previous action. Her body was found surrounded by 5 cubs. Sadly enough, the carcass of Chastel's animal, inadequately preserved with straw by the surgeon Boulanger, was sent to Paris in the care of the Marquis's servant Joubert, but by the time it reached the Hôtel de la Rochefoucauld in the Rue de Sens, it had putrefied. Buffon examined what remained, confirmed it was a wolf, and it was buried, probably in the hotel garden. Jean Chastel received 72 livres from the Diocese of Mantes in September 1767, shared further diocesan and provincial gratifications, and eventually 1,500 livres of the royal bounty. The remainder pursued by his heirs into the revolutionary period. Chastel continued to sign parish registers until his death on March 6, 1789, at the age of 81, and was buried the following day in the cemetery of La Bessière-Saint-Marie. A commemorative stele by Philippe Capelin was inaugurated there in July 1995. Now, what is interesting is the previous incident that, as we've seen, that had brought Chastel to sort of have an argument with the royal authority, but so he seems very much into the affair, to the point he also managed to kill the biggest wolf. As you understand, even just because of the relative ambiguity, also the local affairs, the misunderstandings, this sort of unclear dynamic, because it's not like everything can be fully reconstructed, helped augmenting the legend of the loup de Gévaudan. The killings that had begun with the unfortunate Jean Boulet in the high summer of 1764 ended with absolute finality on the evening on June the 19th, 1767, in the woods of Montmouchet. Contemporary authorities and the overwhelming majority of subsequent historians have regarded the Beast of Gévaudan story as the work of one or more wolves that, through injury, habituation, or exceptional circumstances, had become habitual man-eaters. And this phenomenon had already been documented before, the same in France. For example, there were many other beasts in French history. The one of Auxerrois, Lyonnais, Soissonnais, Savant, so pretty much like everywhere across the country, as well as after this period in other regions of France. Between 1420, where the time really of Jeanne d'Arc, in 1950, the time of Charles de Gaulle, we have to make a video about the former, the latter we covered last year, France recorded at least 23 distinct episodes of man-eating wolves, killing more than 10 people each. Right? And this is as disturbing as it sounds. It's not unique, but the Gévaudan episode really beats them all. The unusual size and markings of the two principal animals killed, the Chastel family's marginal reputation, this sort of weird, like almost witchcraft's kind of character connected with them to this sort of knowledge of the wolves of the terrain, and the weird coincidences also regarding their temporary arrest. That is the mysteriously complete cessation of attacks during the imprisonment of the three Chastel in 1765. So the modest rewards granted to the final slayer that may have underscored some kind of dark reputation. Again, the fact that the animal killed by Jean Chastel was described, as a matter of fact, in the official procès-verbal as, quote, un loup, mais extraordinaire, et bien différent. So a wolf, yes, but extraordinary and well different from the first one. It was already, as we've seen, like a pretty extraordinary wolf. Have together ensured that the affair remains, 2.5 centuries later, the subject of unending analysis and conjecture. By the way, the first wolf that had been, as we've seen, stuffed and sent to Versailles, etc., at some point was destroyed because Louis XV said that this was attracting some negative force or whatever. Imagine, like, it's awkward and sort of creepy enough to have this this animal that has actually eaten lots of people just displayed somewhere, and so imagine again the mentality of the era. The dark tonic characteristic of this Black Legion revolving it. So Chastel's figure is, again, the most anecdotally fascinating, right? Not much of an important person, as we've seen, but one so tied with the events that couldn't but create some further fantasy around them. There is no surviving document from the Gévaudan affair, from the 18th century, accusing, for example, any human being of training, releasing, or directing the Gévaudan animal. And every verified attack ceased, however, the day the same Jean Chastel fired his single shot in the Song d'Auvers. To understand why the terror lasted so long and spread so wide, one must picture the Gévaudan of the 1760s. This was, as we've seen at the beginning, a sparsely populated high plateau country of granite and basalt with a population density of only 18 inhabitants per square kilometer in 1760. Its villages often no more than a church and a handful of stone houses scattered across windswept commons. Its economy is still almost entirely pastoral. This thing had stopped to the Middle Ages. And winters were long and cruel. The snow could lie from September to May. And as soon as the first mild days arrived, children as young as 7 or 8 were, as we've seen, sent out alone in small groups to watch cattle on the distant summer pastures, armed only with a stick. The wolf population of France, perhaps 20,000 strong, had been pushed in the remotest massives, so exactly in these areas, by centuries of organized hunts in the country. Yet, in fact, wolves remain numerous, exactly in places like the Marguerite and the Montagne de la Marguerite. Parish boundary records show that between 1760 and 1764, the canton of Saugues alone paid for the destruction of 148 wolves, which is also a considerable expense, considering these were just, as we've seen, peasants, herdsmen. But that's exactly the point. If you have to defend your cattle, these wolves are a veritable plague. But just the number is so big. Like, only in 4 years, you need practically 30 wolves a year to be killed or more. Now, hunger, rabies, injury, or the simple absence of natural prey could turn a wolf itself into a man-eater. It's not, again, that frequent at all in general, like normal wolf behavior. But there is this almost sort of vampiristic characteristic that is, once the wolf has tasted human flesh, it rarely reverts. It takes a liking to that. The press, above all the Courrier d'Avignon, seized on the story with a mixture of horror and commercial glee. Was one of the most prominent sources to spread the information. Within weeks, the beast was being portrayed in engravings as a monstrous hybrid, part wolf, part hyena, part dragon even. And there was an old series that is the only part of Schwerpunkt content you don't see anymore, for reasons as we'll have to remake it, as a matter of fact, that has actually a lot going on regarding this symbolism. Also, as you see in these videos, pictures, you can't see all these engravings from the era, specifically depicting the Beast of Gévaudan, which is somehow rare. You don't find this enormous amount of iconography for the time, or a single incident of this kind. Because rumor multiplied. It was said, the animal was said to be bulletproof, to leap 30-foot walls, to be accompanied by a human master who directed it with whistles, to be the offspring of a lion in a she-wolf, almost in Dante's Inferno, to have been shipped from Africa by a vengeful nobleman. The latter, in fact, is even the plot of a movie about the Gévaudan beast that was made by French, like the French cinema somehow sort of still goes on with even public funding, but to have sort of mildly interesting movies, and that one, it was not a particular pearl or anything, but again, considering all the other weird movies of this era, the topic at least was interesting, and so all these voices and all these myths revolving around the Gévaudan beast. In Paris and London, the affair was followed as avidly as any modern serial killer case. It's not like at the time there weren't such things. Now, offers of help also poured in. Poison recipes, trained bears, Cossack trackers from Ukraine, even a proposal to import Canadian lynxes to chase the animal. And against this background, these successive expeditions sent by the French crown appear almost pitifully inadequate, if you think about it. The Douaumins 56 light infantry, for all their discipline and rifled carbines, could not cover a territory larger than many English counties. The Naval, accustomed to the open plains of Normandy, were baffled by the labyrinth of bogs, ravines, and dense chestnut forest of the Gévaudan. François Antoine succeeded as the official top guy only because he refused to believe the monster was anything but a wolf, and because he was lucky enough to corner one large specimen in the right wood on the right day. Right, so a mix of attitude and luck, which gets things done. But as you've seen, the first wolf was nothing like the latter. Even though the greatest amount of slaughter had been carried out would dilute after this point. When attacks resumed, the court simply lost interest in the affair, so they basically let these people on their own. The king had been made to look foolish once and would not risk it again with his stuffed, wolf at Versailles. The final phase of the terror from late 1765 to mid-1767 was concentrated in the high northern triangle around Saugues and the three great summits, Montmouchet, Montgrand, Montchavet, as we've seen, where the Chastel family lived. And here, the animals, as we've seen still at this point, behave with far greater caution. This is striking, because they were really intelligent. If that was the thing, if they had cooperated, it's as if they almost understood what was going on. But it's their pack behavior that adapted accordingly, even if they had separated from the first. They rarely attacked groups, avoiding the great battue organized by local nobles, striking and vanishing. Right. By the way, this is even more interesting if you think that these wolves had basically become man-eaters altogether. Because if they had started in packs, even though the sightings were just one wolf at a time, as we've seen, but as we've seen also from the battue, that there were multiple trails, right, tracking different animals at a time, the technicalities of the hunt, they imagine one wolf had attacked first a man, and they had all devoured the carcass at some point. That also maybe explain the horrifying state of the victims. Most of the time, heads found, kilometers away, transported for which reason? By the way, it's as if always these wolves had been sadistic in a way, and so they learned, even after having tasted collectively human flesh and blood, how they had to behave. They wanted to have more of that, and it was in this same triangle that Jean Chastel, already 59 years old at the time, literate, as we have seen, he signed parish registers in a clear hand, which was not really normal for these people there at the time. Yet portrayed, for this reason, by the way, to enhance a bit the miserable background, by 19th century romancers, hunted almost daily. His son Pierre and Jean-Antoine were known as gamekeepers on the estates of the Marquis d'Apcher, that, as we've seen, also organized the battue. The family was poor, marginal, touched by scandal. They were cursed, in a way. The fugitive murderer Jean-Pierre, the nickname de la Masque of Jean Chastel, so almost like an enchantment, right? These people almost seem as if they knew these wolves already. Yet they moved freely through the forest where the beast lived at the time. So there is definitely like a good dark legend about this family that emerges. When the 19-year-old Marquis d'Apcher organized the hunt of June the 19th, 1767, he took with him 12 trusted local men who knew every path and sign of the Tenazère. Jean Chastel was among them. Who knows what these men thought about him, by the way, because they knew equally how to cope with these animals. At the Saint-Dove, Chastel loaded his heavy hunting gun with 1 bolt and 5 large buckshot. No silver, no blessed metals, no miraculous liturgy beyond the ordinary prayers any devout peasant might say before a day's beating. The animal crossed in front of him at perhaps 30 paces. It was enormous, as we've seen, 1 meter long. 1 shot to the shoulder, the hounds finished it. And so the terror ended, but that episode in which the same soldiers had basically been ambushed by the Chastel, having had these men's guns pointed at them, it is fascinating, including the arrest and the pose in the attacks during their detainment. And so it's also strange how, yes, they eventually tracked down the right wolves at some point because the terror ended as abruptly as it had begun 3 years later, but nobody can really ever explain what overall happened. The procès verbal drawn up the next day by Roche-Etienne Marron is sober and precise, an extraordinarily large wolf, but a wolf at the same time. And even though the look was eccentric, the measurements are those of a canid. The dental formula, as we've seen, is that of a canid. Survivors, we have seen the beast at close quarters, women who had fought it with pitchforks and billhooks, even though mostly also the first one, children who had stared into its eyes. So identified the latter carcass they had encountered before without hesitation. So we're fairly well informed about the wall. It's unusual also, as we were saying, in terms of sources of the documentation. And when the Marquise's men killed the she-wolf and her cubs a week later, the chain was complete. Right? It's as if the seed of the monster had been properly eradicated from the face of the earth at that point. Later generations, uneasy with the idea that a simple peasant had succeeded where royal hunters failed, because that's also a bit what the broader picture shows, embroidered the story by itself. By the 1830s, for example, the abbot Pierre Pourchet was collecting oral traditions. You're talking, at the time, there were kids who remember Chastel back in the day, and that cast him as a pious hero who waited until he had finished his rosary before firing, or who loaded his gun with silver melted from a statue of the Virgin, so to properly, like just like you shoot at vampires. And there was something of that. Like there is surely in the folklore of these people the idea of the werewolf, the idea of the children of the night and more. And so the whole satanic character of this picture we will never fully appreciate, unfortunately, but minimally through these sources, that how these men and women would really live through this. By the 1930s, novelists like Abel Chevalier and Henri Pourrat transformed Chastel's son Antoine into a castrated pirate's slave who trained hyenas for a sadistic novel. And again, this is excessive. Again, unfortunately, it's also about, again, the aforementioned movie sort of where to represent is a bit of fantasy story that is historically set, but taking sort of a different turn. And in fact, none of these embellishments appear in any document written before 1809, 1810. There is indeed something about sort of the further modernization and secularization of mind that is so distant, especially in France after the Revolution, and everything changed, even in the imaginary, in literature, in fantasy. The Silver Bullet Legion, for example, the Tale of the Blessed Meadows, the confession of sudden remorse after the death of Marie-Jeanne, all are absent from the parish registers, notarial minutes, the correspondence of Lafont, Belinvilliers, Saint-Prix, or the Marquis d'Apcher. And so Chastel was maybe just a strange person, tied surely to this weird sort of cults, the local Occitanian folklore, a bit of Catarism vibe still under the ashes, or something like witchcraft. Again, the connection would evolve. The rural world is quite something. Like also from my family, I have sort of from the peasant side of the family back in the day, at least, pretty interesting stories of werewolves in towns rather than the countryside, as a matter of fact. But it's still it's still fascinating. Now, what remains, as far as the Gévaudan is concerned, is the plain record between the summer of 1764 and the summer of 1767. Somewhere between 90 to 120 human beings, almost all of them children, or young women alone, on the high pastures were killed, and in many cases partly devoured by one or more large canids operating over a territory of roughly 15 square kilometers. We think it was a lupus italicus, that there is also that the whole thing like was this a giant wolf, was deformed, had sort of different colors, sort of reddish, fur, longer. Again, forms of giantism exist. We think that this was a lupus italicus that arrives from sort of, from the Italian to the Apennine Peninsula to Provence, and so also up to the Massif Central. There are other sort of areas of Europe where it's manifested. There are different types of wolves pretty much everywhere. But we, unfortunately, regarding the latter wolf, don't have much information in practice. We can't see it. All right. So, for example, the first one was better documented, but also they are like with less kind of. Also, we don't have the broader picture. We just see that this werewolves, but we don't really understand what kind of biological characteristics they really had per se. Surely they were, especially the latter. The latter was very anomalous, to say the least, but it was recognized as a wolf. Any other option, etc., like 18th century peasants knew very well like how to, aristocrats so on alike, because of their hunting experience and more, how to recognize a wolf. And especially like the two animals matching the descriptions given by hundreds of survivors, having been killed, being recognized also post-mortem, are sort of solving a bit the mystery. These were likely the most important of the pack, if again there had been a broader association. Certain wolves can also be alone, but as we've seen, the latter had a family of some sort. François Antoine, September 1765, Jean Chastel, June 1767. These are the guys who killed the animals. And so after the second in particular, no further verified attack ever took place. The wolves of the Gévaudan were not supernatural, or at least, what is natural, what is supernatural. They were wolves, however, and we can be pretty sure that they weren't directed by human hands, right? It's unrealistic, and so it doesn't make much sense. They were simply wolves that, for reasons we never fully understand, had learned that the small, defenseless humans scattered across the lonely uplands were easy prey, and unleashed an unprecedented level sort of bloodshed that plagued, damned, cursed this local communities in ways they would have definitely wanted to avert. So it's just a story, right, that I thought could be useful as far as the general the general mood of the period. We covered so many things, but we don't normally focus too much on there's also folk stories, etc. And we will, if anything, come back more on different things like legions, right? The wolf in folklore, symbolism, mythology. That is obviously very important also for our military historical series, Beast Warriors and Similia. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.